Hi, so this week's topic is going to be a way to think about class, and I'm going to do it through my work on Hipsters and Bogans. So the readings for this week are from a couple of chapters from that book, where I write about that stuff. I'm going to do it in two parts. I'm going to kind of do a more description part first of Hipsters and Bogans in general and what they mean, and then kind of go into some of the sociology of it in the second half. So, to begin with, I've already kind of spoke in the course about youth culture and the studies of youth culture. So I think that the kind of looking at the figures of Hipster and Bogans is kind of the way that I talk about them, is a good way to consider many of the issues that have kind of been historically important in youth cultural studies. So there's kind of the ways that different, groups of people express identity, the way they can be, racialized and genderized and classed. But they also kind of speak into kind of more broader political concerns, such as things like, whether they're kind of, ideologically consuming or, being more resistive, creative, that some of the debates around the original subcultures showed. Then there's been the ways that kind of after those original studies done in the 60s and 70s, the way that the post-cultural studies started to highlight how there was kind of different, geographical influences on those subcultures, and also a kind of maybe a broader generalisation of the way that youth practice subcultures. Practice culture. And what I mean by that is that subculture became a term to think of, very specific practices, and it was argued that we needed other concepts to think about what was going on more broadly. And again, I think Hipsters and Bogans definitely are not subcultures in that sense. They're not really things that people claim as an identity. They, people that are punks say that they're punks. People that are goths say that they're goths. People don't really say that they're hipsters or bogans. They tend to be these kind of figurative terms that we use to put other people in a place. And I'll relate that to kind of some Borgesian theory throughout the lecture. It also, I think, is a way of moving beyond the way that I think a lot of youth cultural studies have tended to focus on people like us, so those kind of insider things where punks study punks, or at least people that are interested in politically resistive things study people that are doing politically resistive things, or a focus on more spectacular things that youth culture does, or even kind of more creative things. There isn't a lot of work done over the years on more mainstream stuff, I suppose, that is kind of celebrated, or more kind of mundane and everyday, or even more vulgar stuff like violent communities and things like the alt-right and stuff like that are now getting more and more attention in terms of research. So again, things like the Hipsters and Bogans are a way of kind of moving beyond this kind of spectacular and the symbolic, I suppose, in many ways, and thinking about how these kind of everyday objects, everyday things that are kind of brought up in conversation a lot between people, or in the media, or used as comedy, are a way of kind of organising the way that we think about the world as well. So the way that I think about Hipsters and Bogans, and the way that I'm positioning them, is they're kind of a way of thinking about how class is made in everyday life, in terms of relations to other people, relations to the things that other people do, their cultural practices, but also our relations to things like the way that the media represents other people as well. So there's a kind of complexity of levels going on there. And I kind of think about these things as kind of fuzzy sites of cultural class conflict, where we identify with one or the other, or we use them to kind of put other people in particular, often stereotypical categories. So in a way, this is a way of doing class analysis in that sense. So I like to think about this through a Borgesian lens, and I've kind of outlined Bourdieu's work in the course already as well. So to think about this really broadly, I think, Waquan's quote there about how social people, people are suffering beings, collectively engaged in embodied activities, staged in circles of shared commitments. I think this is a kind of a nice way of putting the kind of version of the human that Bourdieu kind of invokes in these kind of the way that he does research and thinks about the way basically people relate to others. Now that certainly doesn't cover all of the aspects of being a human. It's just kind of one of those things, but it's particularly I think useful for thinking about these kind of struggles over, things like fashion, or, what's a good cup of coffee, or, is the supercars, a vulgar kind of, destruction of the East End of Newcastle or something. The way the kind of class is relating here is the way around people's tastes, and the way that people have different morals and values. The different ways they, I suppose, perceive what it means to have a good life, a moral life, a valuable life, a satisfying life. The way that we kind of think about other people then as often kind of these almost denigratory things through these kind of categories of hipsters and bogans. So they kind of drive what I would call an affective economy. They make us feel particular things, and how we relate to them largely relates to our own position in the world. So what you might define a hipster or a bogan might be different to someone else. So again, they're kind of relational in that sense. It's a way of thinking about how class boundaries are quite fuzzy, but they're also quite relational. Another way of thinking about these things is they make thinkable sayable. They can kind of allow our kind of inner prejudices to kind of come out, and Bourdieu calls this a class racism. And it kind of remains permissible as long as it's elicited through symbols, morals and values. And we kind of, again, have these kind of hierarchical relationships with other peoples and other groups through those categories, and I'll kind of unpack that more in a minute. So our relationship to the way we think about hipsters and bogans, both as a category, but also whether we kind of use those categories to, label other people, also kind of labels us. So it relates back to that very famous Borgesian quote, taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. So hipsters and bogans classify in the sense that we use them to classify people, but the way that we would be positioned ourselves in that kind of affective economy classifies us. So you're probably well familiar with the kind of various images of hipsters and bogans. I've just got a couple in there in the lecture notes for you to have a look at. But there's a kind of broad assemblage of traits that are kind of bound up into these kind of figurative terms. In terms of defining them, I mean, they're used colloquially a lot, and there's a lot of media that uses hipsters and bogans all the time. You'll see in the chapter in the book where I kind of list a whole bunch of stuff. It was kind of endless when I was doing the research. I certainly couldn't have covered or even collected, all the kind of stories and opinion pieces and comedies and all that throughout the whole globe that were kind of using the hipster in particular. And in Australia too, particularly in the kind of mid-2000s, till a few years ago, the kind of figure of the bogan was coming up, really commonly in day-to-day media. There's not a huge amount of academic research done on these things. There's a little bit of stuff on the hipster, and it's kind of a growing field as well. It normally takes a while for academic research to come out, so the hipster's only a relatively new phenomenon over the past kind of 15 years or so. And the same with the kind of bogan. Of course, Australia's a relatively small academic market. There's not a huge amount of research on it, but there's, again, I've got stuff in the course guides that you can have a look at that. But there is a kind of solid body of work about the figure of the chav in the UK, which in some ways is similar, but is also a bit different as well. The chav is kind of much more, I think, an insult, where the bogan in Australia is a little bit more playful. So the whole bunch of kind of different touchstones and cultural traits and texts and things that you would kind of can attach to these things. I suppose what I'm pointing out here is that these are the different things that kind of make up what the stereotype and the figure becomes. So you can see there in that list, I'm not going to go through all that, but like the different kind of, music that these kind of people listen to, bogans listen to kind of rock and Triple M, where, the hipster is more likely to listen to, bands that apparently don't exist yet. All those kind of things that have become really common to think about these kind of figures. A kind of, again, relations of class in that sense. V8 cars versus hybrids and hatchbacks, fast food versus organic food. They read different things, they consume different things, they live in different spaces. The urban hipster is kind of the more suburban bogan. Branded clothing versus vintage clothing, that kind of stuff. So again, this is the kind of ways that kind of taste classifies, and the way they kind of then relate to these labels, or what I call figures, in this kind of analysis. So not only is there a bunch of kind of consumer activities and things that are kind of, I suppose, associated with these figures, But they also then become somewhat pathologized. There's like a character of the bogan and hipster that develops, throughout the kind of the way that these things are set up. So they have these kind of different apparent character traits, different levels of education, different attitudes towards things. The bogan generally is kind of positioned as being aggressive and positioned as being relatively masculine, regardless if it's a male or female, where the hipster is kind of positioned as being more caring and effeminate. It's kind of the bogan's a threat, while the hipster's a bit of a wimp. The bogan's always positioned as being racist and sexist and misogynist and violent, where the hipster not so much. The hipster is often positioned as being much more woke, but as the analysis that I've done of this kind of stuff shows that there's a whole bunch of kind of ironic racism and sexism done through the name of the hipster, I suppose. They have, different tastes. One's conspicuous, one's more authentic. One's meant to be a mindless consumer, the bogan, while the kind of hipster's meant to be creative, but creativity tends to be positioned as more kind of, PR for themselves or culturally appropriating things that already exist. There's obvious tastes relating to brands, and there's obscure tastes and that kind of thing. There's individual traits as well around the bogan's always positioned as being lazy and vulgar, while the hipster's about self-promotion. There's blue-collar work as opposed to white-collar work, and different levels of education. So what I've kind of developed my interest in studying this in the first place is that I got called both of these things throughout the kind of last decade or so. And so it shows to me that, class obviously relates to material circumstances, but it seems to relate as much to cultural things and taste and morals and values as that. So I suppose throughout that time, I probably got much more economically secure and much more middle class in terms of my own economic circumstances. But, I still feel quite working class in many senses. That's kind of the way I grew up, and I feel uncomfortable in many middle class spaces. But more in terms of my own kind of, I suppose, consumer and leisure practices, I suppose have traits of both the hipster and bogan in that sense. I love a sausage roll and eating a meat pie. I wear thongs as much as I can in the summer and spend a lot of time at the beach. I've pretty much been wearing the same kind of clothes, since I was a kid, really. So that's kind of seen as bogan stuff. But, I'm into kind of fairly obscure music, and I buy, tapes and records, and I go to gigs that aren't really at pubs or clubs and all that kind of stuff. Even things like social theory are often kind of positioned as a kind of hipster interest. So my own different kind of social groups that I'm friends with have both called me, one a hipster and one a bogan at different times. So you can see how these kind of figures, or these signifiers, the things that they're associated with, are somewhat floating in that sense. They can be attached to different people, but largely that attachment, the way that you do it, is based on, what you think about yourself and your own positionality. So I'm interested in, I suppose, in how these things are used to engender a way of thinking about oneself and to thinking about other people, thinking about other groups, and what that means in terms of the way that class is made in day-to-day life. The other kind of ways to think about these kind of sliding categories as well is that, in the kind of about 4 or 5 years ago, I think now, Newcastle was named as one of the top 5 hipster cities in the world, largely around the kind of Renew Newcastle activities in particular and the different things that were going on there. But, it's also referred to all the time as like a bogan town, and with the Knights, and it's, got a very white culture in that sense, and it's, had BHP, a real working class culture. Another way to think about the sliding things is attachments as well is the kind of Mona, the pretty awesome gallery in Hobart. The festivals around Mona are often described as a hipster's Disneyland, but by more kind of apparently authentic art consumers that are from the art world, there was a lot of consternation when Mona first started. Were they presenting art for bogans? Why do people need iPods to be able to listen to descriptions of the art and all that kind of stuff? You need to just already know that to appreciate art properly. David Walsh is a kind of who owns Mona, is kind of positioned as a hipster millionaire. Then you got kind of Nathan Tickler, kind of former bogan or bogonaire as has been kind of positioned. So you can see even with kind of people that are actual literal millionaires, the class positionality in terms of the culture can change. So, you know, a billionaire can still be a bogan in that sense. You know, a millionaire can be a hipster or whatever. So here the kind of class cultural tastes and associations, you know, more often than not map on to, I suppose, material and economic scales. The bogan, you know, is seen to be more working class and poor. The hipster tends to be more middle class. But again, even if the generality of that is not really all that accurate, because, you know, we have in Barbara Pinney's amazing work about the cashed up bogan, a lot of kind of people that seem to be kind of upset that, you know, miners earn lots of money and they, you know, buy jet skis and stuff, where the hipster that tends to be associated with more middle class tastes is often, particularly, you know, in their 20s, doing, you know, all kinds of precarious casualised work and not really earning much money above the, barely existing above the poverty line as well. So again, there's a kind of blurriness to how these things work, but the blurriness is important in terms of the way then class overall is denied as a kind of important category in the way that we think about these things. So in terms of the analysis, I'm using what's called a figurative method, which is developed by Imogen Tyler in a really amazing book called Revolting Subjects, which I couldn't recommend more, a kind of analysis of various abject figures in the UK around people that were involved in riots and the chav and young mothers and things like that. So it's a way of kind of, you know, tracking these different signifiers in the different ways that they're used and the different ways that I suppose that they're put to work. So in the research that I did, I focused on comment pieces and opinion pieces and news pieces about the Hipsters and Bogans, and I also did some analysis of different comedy and parody stuff that invokes those figures as well. So it's important here for the second half of the lecture to remember that I'm not really talking about real people here. I'm talking about the representation of people more often than not, and the way that those kind of representations are used to kind of create hierarchies within culture, within taste systems, and with also kind of promoting some morals and values over others.